Everyone thought he was just the quiet janitor, the guy who mopped the floors and stayed out of the way. But one day, he spoke fluent Japanese to the cold, silence-o, and the entire office froze. What no one knew is that this moment would unlock a secret he'd kept buried for years. And when you hear what she said in that elevator, you'll never forget it. And if you're someone who loves stories that touch the heart, reveal the unexpected, and remind us how powerful kindness and love can be, then make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. These are the kinds of stories we tell here. And trust me, this one is just getting started. Most people didn't even notice Jake when he walked by. He moved through the hallways like a shadow, quiet, focused, and always with a mop or cleaning cart nearby. He wasn't the kind of man who made noise or tried to get attention. He simply showed up, did his work, and left without a word. The office lights reflected off the polished floors he cleaned every evening, but no one ever stopped to think about who kept them that way. Jake knew their names, their coffee orders, their birthdays. But no one ever asked him his. And that was fine. He wasn't there to be seen, just to do his job. Every morning started the same. Jake would pack his son's lunch, tie his sneakers, and walk him to the bus stop. His son, Max, was 7, bright, curious, and always asking questions Jake didn't always know how to answer. They had their own little world, just the two of them. Jake would wave as the bus drove off, then head to the building downtown where he worked. The security guards knew him, gave him a nod. But even they didn't know much more than his first name. Jake didn't mind. His world was small, but it was his. He wasn't always invisible. Once upon a time, he had a different life. One filled with laughter, dinners out, and soft music in the kitchen. His late wife, Aiko, brought color to everything. She had this way of making life feel lighter. But when she got sick, the world turned gray, and when she passed, that color disappeared completely. Jake never really found it again. Now, every choice he made was for Max. Every hour he worked, every step he took, was about keeping them moving forward. Love hadn't left him, but it had changed shape into responsibility. Jake's uniform was plain, but always clean. He wore a navy blue jacket with his name stitched in white thread, Jake. The name tag felt like the only place in the building where his name really existed. He didn't need more than that. He had his headphones, his cart, and the quiet comfort of routine. The executives walked by in polished shoes, eyes on their phones, voices loud. Jake moved behind them, cleaning up their footprints, literally and figuratively. He never expected anyone to see him. That's why, when someone finally did, it caught him completely off guard. There was one person, though, who noticed him. Not in a loud way. Not in a flirtatious or obvious way. But in a way that made Jake's steps feel just a little different. She would pass by and glance at him, just briefly, and it wasn't pity. It wasn't curiosity either. It felt more like recognition. Like maybe she saw something in him the others missed. Jake tried not to think too much about it. He wasn't looking for connection. He didn't even believe it was real. But that glance stayed with him longer than it should have. He'd sometimes find himself in the lobby just as she stepped out of the elevator. Their timing was always oddly aligned. He'd keep sweeping, pretending not to notice. But every now and then, she'd nod at him. She smiled. Just a small curve of the lips, but it hit Jake like a shockwave. She was the CEO. The one everyone talked about but rarely saw up close. Miyuki Takeda. Quiet, sharp, unreadable. And yet, in that moment, she seemed more human than anyone else in the building. Jake kept his eyes down, but his thoughts spiraled. Back in the janitor's closet, he'd replay those little moments. Silly, really. What was he doing, thinking about her like that? They lived in different universes. She ran the company. He cleaned the floors. But still, something about her presence lingered. He'd remember the way her heels clicked down the hallway. The scent of something floral and clean. The way she looked past everyone, yet for some reason, paused just slightly when she passed him. He told himself it was nothing. But something in his gut didn't agree. Jake wasn't bitter. Life had taken its hits, and he'd taken them quietly. He didn't complain. Didn't blame anyone. His focus was Max, always. The laughter of his son in the evenings, the little questions at bedtime, that's what kept him going. He didn't need attention or praise. He just needed to provide, to protect, to make it through one day at a time. But lately, something had started to shift. Just a little. As if the universe was preparing something unexpected. Something he never would have dared to imagine. On that Tuesday morning, everything seemed normal. The elevator dinged. Papers shuffled. Phones rang. Jake mopped the marble floors like he always did. But the air felt different, somehow. Sure. Like something was about to happen. And as he turned the corner near the executive wing, he heard a soft voice. Speaking a language he hadn't heard in years. Japanese. Just one word. Spoken clearly. And without even thinking, Jake replied, fluent, calm, natural. The silence that followed was louder than anything he'd ever heard in his life. No one really knew much about Miyuki Takeda. She appeared in the office like a gust of cold wind, elegant, quiet, untouchable. One day, the boardroom was buzzing about a new CEO from Tokyo, and the next, she was walking through the executive wing like she'd always been there. She dressed simply but with taste, always in tailored suits, mostly in black or gray. Her hair was neatly tied back, her eyes unreadable. She didn't bother with small talk or polite smiles. She came to work, led her meetings, and left without a trace. People said she was brilliant, but distant. And honestly, most employees feared her more than they admired her. She didn't use assistants the way other executives did. She preferred to carry her own laptop, keep her own calendar, and walk without an entourage, except for two silent bodyguards who always followed at a respectful distance. No one had ever seen her lose her temper. But no one had seen her laugh either. She moved through the company like a ghost, always present, never really there. Some said she came from money. Others whispered that she built herself up from nothing. But no one really knew. She had a talent for keeping her personal life locked behind a wall no one dared to climb. Every time she walked into a room, the energy shifted. Conversations would stop. Phones would slide into pockets. People stood straighter. She didn't have to speak to command attention. Her silence was louder than most people's shouting. Meetings with her were intense, not because she was rude or mean, but because she rarely said more than she had to. When she did speak, her words were chosen carefully, delivered in a soft but firm tone. And when she didn't speak, people filled the silence with nervous guesses, afraid of what she might be thinking behind that calm face. Some employees joked that she might be a robot. Others said she had some secret plan to restructure everything and fire half the company. But all of it was just gossip. The truth was, no one really knew what went on behind her sharp eyes and quiet demeanor. What kept her up at night? What made her laugh? Did she even laugh at all? Her office on the top floor was always closed unless she was in a meeting. And even then, the glass walls seemed to reflect everyone else, but never her. She was there, yet never fully reachable. Like she lived in a different dimension. Despite her silence, the company had grown under her leadership. Profits were up. Deals were closing faster. Clients seemed impressed. Investors were thrilled. She delivered results, and in the corporate world, that's what mattered most. But there was something else too, something unspoken. A feeling that beneath all that discipline and efficiency, there was a story. A history no one had the courage to ask about. Some tried to Google her past, but found little. Just a few articles, some awards, a photo or two from old conferences. Nothing personal. Nothing real. She never joined company events or office parties. When birthdays came around, she didn't send flowers or notes. Not out of rudeness, it just didn't seem to be on her radar. She ate lunch alone or sometimes not at all. If she needed something, she emailed. If something went wrong, she fixed it quietly. She never raised her voice. But somehow, her presence alone could quiet a room in seconds. That kind of power doesn't come from words. It comes from something deeper. And whatever it was, Miyuki had it. She didn't need to explain herself, because no one dared to ask. But there was one thing people kept noticing. She walked the same route every day. Same elevator. Same hallway. And always, just before reaching her office, she would glance, just briefly, toward the maintenance corridor. It didn't make sense. Nothing was ever happening there. Just mops, carts, cleaning supplies. And yet, her eyes would pause there for half a second. Not long enough to be obvious, but long enough to be strange. Some thought it was just coincidence. Others wondered if she saw something, or someone no one else did. Miyuki wasn't cold. At least, not in the way people assumed. She had learned long ago that silence was a shield. A way to survive. To lead. Back in Japan, life had taught her that emotions could be dangerous if left unchecked. So she locked them away, one by one. Smiles. Laughter. Even love. She folded each memory like a letter and filed it somewhere deep inside. But every now and then, something stirred. A familiar scent. A certain sound. Or a person who didn't try to impress her, who just existed quietly, like her. She had noticed him before. The janitor with kind eyes and a quiet presence. He didn't stare. He didn't speak. He just worked. And somehow, that simplicity stood out more than all the noise around her. She didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but something about the way he moved, focused, calm, almost invisible, felt strangely familiar. Like a memory she couldn't place. She never said a word to him, but her gaze lingered. Just a moment longer than it should have. And though she'd never admit it, part of her hoped he had noticed too. Jake didn't expect to see her up close. He usually worked after most of the office staff had left, especially in the executive wing. But that morning, for some reason, his schedule was shifted. He had been called upstairs to clean a spill outside the boardroom before a big meeting. As he pushed his cart down the hallway, he could feel the difference in the air. Everything was shinier, quieter, more serious up there. He kept his head down, focusing on the task until he looked up, and there she was. Miyuki Takeda. Walking toward him like a force wrapped in calm. And then, for a split second, their eyes met. It wasn't just a casual glance. Something in the way she looked at him felt intentional, like she had been about to say something but changed her mind at the last moment. Her eyes locked with his, calm but searching, and it felt like time paused for a breath. Jake's heart beat a little faster, not from fear, but from surprise. He wasn't used to being seen, not really. People passed him all day without a second thought. But she had stopped, not physically, but with her attention. And that kind of pause meant something, even if neither of them understood what. He quickly looked away, pretending to check the mop bucket, even though it was fine. It was a reflex. Years of blending in, of keeping things simple, had trained him to avoid eye contact. But now, he wished he'd held it a moment longer. She hadn't looked angry or annoyed. Just curious. And something else. Softness? Maybe? No, that couldn't be right. She was the CEO, and he was just a janitor. Nothing more than two ships passing in a hallway. Still, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something had passed between them. Something quiet but real. Miyuki kept walking, her heels echoing down the marble floor, her posture as perfect as ever. She didn't turn around. She didn't say a word. But Jake stood there longer than he meant to, staring at the corner she disappeared behind. He wasn't daydreaming. He wasn't the kind of guy who made up stories in his head. But that moment, it lingered. It felt important, though he couldn't say why. He finally pulled himself together and got back to work. There were floors to clean, bins to empty, and no time for strange thoughts about CEOs and hallway moments. For the rest of the day, Jake found himself drifting. While sweeping near the cafeteria or wiping glass doors, his mind kept going back to her eyes. They weren't cold like everyone said. They were calm, sure, but there was a warmth behind them. Not bright and open, but something quieter, like a candle burning low. Maybe she had just looked through him, not at him. But it hadn't felt that way. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized he wanted to be wrong. He wanted to believe she had seen him, truly seen him, even for a second. Back at home, Jake tried to focus on Max, who was full of energy and questions about his day. They talked over grilled cheese and apples, their usual dinner when time was tight. But even as Jake laughed at his son's silly stories, that brief hallway moment hovered in his mind. He wondered what Miyuki did when she got home. Did she have a family? Did she cook for herself? Or was she alone in some high-rise apartment, eating takeout by the window, just as quiet in her private life as she was at work? The thought surprised him, He hadn't cared about someone else's routine in years. The next morning, he half hoped he'd see her again, but he didn't. The elevator opened, executives shuffled in and out, but Miyuki was nowhere in sight. Jake told himself it was better this way. No need for distractions. No point getting wrapped up in some silly idea. But that didn't stop him from glancing at the hallway just once or twice during his rounds. He wasn't expecting anything. He just noticed. And maybe that was enough. Maybe noticing her meant something more than he realized. Or maybe he was just tired. Meanwhile, on the top floor, Miyuki sat behind her sleek desk, flipping through reports without really reading them. Her mind kept drifting to that moment in the hallway. She had seen him before, of course. Always moving, always focused, never looking up. But that time was different. He had looked at her, really looked, and it wasn't fear or awkwardness she saw in his eyes. It was something she hadn't felt in a long time. Recognition. She didn't know what to do with that feeling. So, she did what she always did. She filed it away and kept working. But something had shifted, and neither of them could quite explain it. One glance, one pause, and the rhythm of their days had changed. Quietly, without warning, like the first crack in a frozen lake. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic, just a subtle shift that no one else could see. But beneath the surface, something had started to move. And even if they tried to ignore it, that glance had already happened. And it was only a matter of time before the silence between them would break. That night, the apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the heater and the scratch of pencils on paper. Jake sat beside Max at the kitchen table, helping him with his math homework. The pages were filled with simple word problems, but Max had something else he wanted to review: his Japanese vocabulary. Jake nodded and opened the practice sheet, his voice gentle as he read the words aloud. Max repeated them, sometimes giggling at the harder ones. Their evenings always ended like this: schoolwork, soft conversation, and just a little Japanese before bedtime. It was their quiet ritual, and it mattered more than Jake let on. Jake hadn't planned on teaching his son a second language. At first, it just slipped into their life naturally, like a memory that refused to fade. Aiko used to sing lullabies in Japanese when Max was a baby. She spoke to him softly in both languages, switching back and forth without thinking. After she passed, Jake realized those words were one of the only things that kept her close. He wasn't fluent at the time, not really. But he had listened. He had learned from her, piece by piece. And now, years later, that language was a thread he wasn't willing to let go. Some nights, Jake would sit on the edge of Max's bed and read old children's books Aiko had brought from Tokyo. He didn't always pronounce everything perfectly, but Max didn't care. To him, it was a special connection, a way to remember the mother he barely knew. For Jake, it was more complicated. Each word carried weight. Some felt warm, others hit like a wave. But speaking them out loud made him feel like she was still part of their lives. It reminded him that grief didn't erase love, it just changed the shape of it. Jake didn't talk about Aiko much, not even with Max. It wasn't that he didn't want to, it just hurt in ways he couldn't explain. She had been the light in his world, the one who made his ordinary life feel extraordinary. He remembered their late-night talks, her laughter in the kitchen, and the way she used to tease him when he messed up Japanese phrases. Her patience never ran out. She believed in quiet strength, in simple joys, in showing up for the people you love. Jake carried all of that with him, even now, even in silence. Every time Jake helped Max with a word or corrected his writing, he felt a mix of pride and pain. Pride because Max was trying, because he cared about his roots, about his mother's culture. Pain because Aiko wasn't there to see it. She would have smiled at how serious Max got when he was learning. She would have sat beside them, gently guiding him with that same calm voice Jake still heard in his dreams. Instead, it was just Jake now, doing his best to fill both roles. Father and mother, teacher and protector, heartbroken and hopeful, all at once. After Max went to bed, Jake cleaned up the table and sat alone for a moment. The apartment felt smaller at night. The walls seemed to lean in, especially when memories started to surface. He pulled out a worn notebook filled with Japanese phrases and grammar rules. Aiko had written little notes in the margins, corrections, explanations, even jokes. Jake ran his finger across the pages, reading her handwriting like it was a message from the past. He whispered a few lines to himself, practicing the tone, the rhythm. It wasn't just about language. It was about holding on. He remembered the day he decided to learn. It was right after Max was born. Aiko was exhausted but glowing, cradling their son while humming softly in Japanese. Jake had watched her and felt a sense of wonder and guilt. He realized he didn't understand half of what she was saying, and he wanted to. Not just for her, but for Max. So he bought books, downloaded apps, listened to audio lessons during night shifts. Aiko laughed at his clumsy sentences, but she never made him feel small. She said it was the effort that mattered. That love lived in the trying. Now, years later, the language came more naturally. Not perfect, but enough to read bedtime stories and carry a soft conversation. Enough to teach Max the words his mom once used. Jake had no idea that those years of quiet learning would mean more than anything he'd ever done. It was more than memory. It was legacy. It was love passed down in syllables and sentences. A connection that couldn't be broken by time or distance or death. Jake didn't realize how rare that was, or how deeply it lived inside him. Outside the window, the city lights flickered. Somewhere out there, people were moving fast, chasing deadlines and dreams. But inside that small apartment, time moved differently. Slower. Softer. And as Jake turned off the kitchen light and headed to bed, he didn't know that the words he spoke tonight, the ones from a language most people in his world didn't understand, would soon echo in the most unexpected place. He had no idea that someone had heard him, or that those same words would open a door he thought was forever closed. The office was buzzing with energy that afternoon. It was the annual company gathering, a rare event where employees mingled, speeches were made, and everyone tried to look just a little more polished. Jake had been assigned to clean the hallway floors leading to the top level, where the executive lounge was located. He didn't mind. Fewer people up there meant fewer stairs. He kept his head down, mop moving in slow, steady motions. Music from the event drifted through the closed doors, muffled but rhythmic. He didn't pay much attention. Until everything suddenly went quiet. There was a short burst of feedback from the sound system, followed by silence. Moments later, footsteps echoed down the hallway, quick and sharp. A woman's figure appeared near the balcony exit, tall, poised, and unmistakably out of place. Jake recognized her instantly. Miyuki Takeda. She wasn't surrounded by guards this time. No assistants, no managers, just her, slipping through the glass doors to the balcony alone. Jake stepped back quickly, hoping to stay invisible like always. But curiosity tugged at him, just for a moment. He moved toward the balcony slowly, just enough to see if she needed help. She was leaning on the railing, her back turned, facing the skyline. Her shoulders looked tense, but not in fear, more like frustration. Then, softly, barely above a whisper, she said something. A single sentence in Japanese. The words floated out into the air like a sigh. Jake froze. He understood what she said. Sometimes I feel like no one sees me. It hit him. The irony. The so powerful, mysterious, feeling invisible just like him. Without thinking, Jake replied. In Japanese. Calmly. Gently. I see you. The words left his mouth before he could second-guess them. There was a silence after that. A long one. Miyuki turned around slowly, her eyes wide with surprise. For a second, she didn't speak. Just stared at him as if trying to figure out who he was. Jake stood still, unsure if he had overstepped. But then something shifted in her expression. Not anger. Not confusion. Something softer. Something like recognition. You speak Japanese? She asked, switching to English now, her voice quieter than he expected. Jake nodded, unsure how much to explain. I learned a while ago, he said simply. Miyuki stepped closer, her expression unreadable. The distance between them felt strangely small, like the hallway and the world outside didn't matter for a moment. She looked at him, not as a janitor, not as someone beneath her, but as a person. It was the first time anyone at the company had looked at him like that. Jake wasn't sure what to do next. He felt exposed, like he had stepped out from behind some invisible wall he'd spent years hiding behind. But Miyuki didn't turn away. Instead, she asked another question, in Japanese this time. Something personal. Where did you learn? Jake hesitated. Then he answered, from my wife. She was Japanese. She passed away a few years ago. There was a truth he rarely shared. Miyuki nodded slowly, and for the first time since he'd seen her, she looked human, vulnerable. The wind picked up a little, brushing strands of her dark hair across her face. She didn't move to fix it. She just stood there, studying Jake like he was some kind of mystery she hadn't expected to find. For someone who rarely spoke to anyone, she suddenly seemed full of quiet questions. Jake didn't offer more. He let the silence speak too. Sometimes, silence carried things words couldn't. The two of them stood like that for a while, no more than a few feet apart, connected by language, memory, and something else neither could name. Then the balcony door creaked open. One of her assistants poked his head out, scanning for her. Jake stepped back, instinctively returning to the shadows. Miyuki glanced at him once more, then gave a slight nod, as if acknowledging something unspoken. She didn't explain what happened out there. She just turned and walked back inside. But something had changed. Not just for her. For Jake too. He went back to his mop, hands steady, heart racing. That one moment felt like the start of something he couldn't quite explain. He returned to his routine like nothing happened. But everything felt different. The way the light hit the floors, the sound of footsteps echoing through the hall, even the air in the building, it all carried a subtle shift. Jake didn't know what it meant yet. But for the first time in years, he felt seen. Not as the janitor. Not as the quiet single dad. Just seen. And he couldn't stop thinking about the way she looked at him. Like she had seen something too. Jake wasn't sure if he would ever see her again the same way. But just a few days later, as he was cleaning near the executive lounge again, the balcony door opened quietly. It was Miyuki. She stepped out without her usual entourage, holding a cup of tea in both hands. Her eyes scanned the hallway and landed on him. For a second, he froze, unsure if he should look away. But then, something incredible happened. She smiled. Just a soft, honest smile, small, but real. Jake blinked, caught completely off guard. It wasn't just that she smiled. It was that she smiled at him. He offered a quiet nod, trying not to seem awkward. She stepped toward him slowly, not rushed, not guarded. I was hoping I'd see you again, she said softly in Japanese. Her voice was calm, not cold like he'd heard others describe it. Jake looked up, surprised. I wasn't sure you'd want to talk, he replied, also in Japanese. She let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. I don't talk to many people, she said. But you're different. He wasn't sure what she meant by that, but he didn't press. They moved toward the balcony together. She leaned on the railing again, just like before, while Jake stood nearby, still holding his mop. This language, she said, glancing sideways at him. It feels like home, but also like a ghost. Jake understood that too well. I speak it for my son, he replied gently. So he doesn't forget her. She didn't ask who those. Something in her eyes said she already understood. The silence between them wasn't heavy this time. It was warm, comfortable, filled with mutual understanding. Their conversation drifted from Japanese proverbs to memories of food, childhood, even awkward first days in new countries. Miyuki admitted that moving to the States had been harder than she expected. Everyone looks at me like I'm untouchable, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I feel invisible. Jake gave a quiet nod. It's strange, he said. I've felt invisible for years. But today you smiled at me. That made her look at him again. Because you saw me first, she replied softly. She told him how she'd lost her father right before taking the job overseas. How grief had hardened her, made her quiet. People mistake silence for strength, she said. But sometimes it's just fear. Jake's chest tightened. He knew that kind of fear, the kind that wraps around your heart when someone you love is gone. Talking about her hurts, he said. But not talking hurts more. Miyuki looked down at her tea, then back up at the skyline. "Maybe silence isn't always strength," she said. "Maybe it's just waiting for the right voice." They laughed quietly at how strange life could be. Two strangers, from opposite ends of the building, one from a corner office, the other from a janitor's closet, speaking the same language not just with words, but with shared pain. Jake felt lighter somehow, like letting these things out made the air easier to breathe. And for the first time, Miyuki looked less like a statue and more like a woman with a heartbeat, standing beside him without barriers. The gap between their worlds didn't feel so wide anymore. Miyuki asked about his son. Jake lit up as he spoke about the boy, how smart he was, how he loved drawing, how they still practiced kanji every night before bed. Her eyes softened. "I never had children," she said. "But I think I would have liked to." She smiled again, and this time, it stayed a little longer. "You're a good father," she added. Jake didn't know how to respond. He just nodded, feeling a warmth rise in his chest that hadn't been there for years. It felt strange and good. They didn't make promises. They didn't plan another meeting. But something had clearly shifted. Jake could see it in the way she lingered before going back inside, in the way her eyes met his without flinching. Miyuki was still the CO. And he was still the janitor. But for a brief moment, those titles disappeared. There was no judgment, no tension, just two people, speaking their truths under a quiet sky. Jake knew that moments like this didn't come often. And even if it ended there, it had been enough to wake something inside him. But deep down, he hoped it wouldn't end there. Because for the first time in a long while, someone saw him, and he saw her. Not through position or power, just as people. Two souls who had been carrying their silence for far too long. And in breaking it, they had both breathed again. What might come next, Jake didn't know. But part of him started to believe that maybe, just maybe, silence had led them exactly where they were meant to be. It started with small moments, passing glances near the coffee machine, a nod in the hallway, a quiet smile exchanged when no one else was looking. Neither of them spoke about it directly, but both felt something shifting, like gravity pulling them closer in the quiet corners of the building. One afternoon, Jake found a note tucked under his mop cart. It simply said, "Balcony. 5:30. No signature. But he knew exactly who it was from. His heart beat faster as he folded it carefully and tucked it into his pocket, pretending nothing was different. At 5:30 sharp, he stepped onto the balcony and found her already there, hair gently moving in the breeze, eyes on the skyline. She turned and gave him that same soft smile, the one she seemed to save just for him. They didn't talk about work. Instead, they spoke about things that made them human. Jake told her about the first time he held his son and how scared he was of messing up. Miyuki shared a story about getting lost in the Tokyo subway as a teenager. They laughed. It was the kind of laughter that filled the air with warmth. These moments became more frequent, though never planned. Sometimes they'd bump into each other in the back stairwell, or end up near the vending machine at the same time. "Coincidence," she'd say with a teasing smile. "Maybe," Jake would reply, but deep down he was starting to hope it wasn't. They began to lean on each other in small, quiet ways. Jake would bring her a cup of green tea from the break room before anyone else arrived. Miyuki would leave him folded origami cranes on his cart, little works of art that reminded him of his late wife. One day, she asked him to teach her a word in English that had no direct translation in Japanese. "Bittersweet," he said after thinking for a moment. "It means something that hurts, but still feels good. Like missing someone you loved." She looked at him for a long time before saying, "We have something like that. Natsukashi. It means a memory that makes you happy, but also a little sad." Jake repeated the word, letting it roll off his tongue slowly. They stood there in silence, not needing to explain more. He started noticing things about her no one else seemed to see. How her eyes crinkled ever so slightly when she was really amused. The way her fingers tapped lightly when she was thinking. How she always paused before answering a personal question, as if weighing the risk of letting someone in. She noticed things about him too. How he always checked his phone at 3:15, his son's dismissal time. The way he straightened every crooked frame on the walls. How he still wore his wedding ring on a chain around his neck. Sometimes their talks went deeper. They shared things that hurt. Jake told her how lonely it was to raise a child without a partner, how he often second-guessed every decision. Miyuki spoke about growing up as the daughter of a powerful man, expected to lead but never to feel. "Everyone wanted me to be strong," she said one evening. "But no one ever asked if I was okay." Jake didn't say anything right away. He just reached out, gently placing his hand near hers on the railing, not touching, just close enough. That simple gesture said more than any words could. It was a silent promise. "I see you. I'm here." And something in her eyes shifted again. She laughed more easily around him now. Not the polite, distant kind of laugh executives use in meetings, but the real kind, the kind that caught her off guard and made her cover her mouth in surprise. The kind that hadn't been heard in years. Jake couldn't help but smile every time. Hearing her laugh felt like a reward, like opening a window in a room that had been sealed for too long. Jake felt something coming alive inside him, something he thought had been buried for good. He found himself humming again while cleaning, smiling without realizing it, looking forward to moments that didn't used to matter. Miyuki seemed lighter too. Her steps were less guarded, her voice less sharp. She even stopped wearing her usual black suits every day, once showing up in a soft gray sweater that made Jake do a double take. "What?" she said, catching him staring. "I can't be comfortable now?" He just chuckled and shook his head. They weren't in love. Not yet. But there was something forming between them, something real and quiet and completely unexpected. Two broken people who didn't know they were allowed to feel whole again. They didn't need to say what it was. The feeling hung between them, fragile but steady, like a bridge neither of them had the courage to fully cross, yet. Still, as Jake watched her walk away that evening, turning back just once to give him a look that made his chest ache, he knew one thing. Something had definitely changed. The shift in Miyuki didn't go unnoticed. People had spent months tiptoeing around her, unsure of what to say or how to act. But now, something had clearly changed. She smiled more often, even made eye contact during meetings. Once, she held the elevator for an intern running late, and the entire floor buzzed about it for the rest of the day. Her voice, once clipped and formal, had softened. She asked people how they were, and actually waited for their answers. Something was different, and everyone could feel it. Rumors always find their way into quiet spaces, and this time was no different. It started with a junior accountant who swore he saw her and Jake talking alone by the balcony. "Just talking," he insisted. But in a company where even a smile from the CEO was headline-worthy, the idea of her chatting with the janitor was too juicy to ignore. Soon, whispers turned into wide eyes. "Did you hear? No way her? There's no chance, right?" The air was thick with speculation. No one dared ask Miyuki, of course, but Jake wasn't so lucky. Jake felt the tension before anyone said a word. People who used to nod at him in the hall now avoided his eyes. Some of the senior staff, ones who never noticed him before, suddenly seemed very aware of his presence. He tried to ignore it, focusing on his tasks like always, but it was hard not to feel the weight of the eyes on his back. The worst part? He didn't even know what they thought had happened. All they saw was someone like him, ordinary, invisible, stepping into a space they didn't believe he belonged. The call came late one afternoon. His supervisor's tone was cold, formal. "The director would like a word with you," he said, without explaining why. Jake walked down the long hallway with heavy steps, heart pounding louder than his shoes on the polished floor. The office was sleek and quiet, filled with glass and chrome, nothing like the world he usually moved through. He sat across from a senior executive whose smile didn't reach his eyes. "We've heard some chatter," the man began, fingers steepled. "And we just want to remind you, know your place." Those words landed like a slap. Jake didn't flinch, but something inside him tightened. "There's been no misconduct," he said quietly, choosing every word carefully. "Nothing inappropriate." The executive leaned back, nodding slowly. "Still," he said, "we expect our employees to act within the boundaries of their roles. You're here to clean floors, not socialize above your station." Jake nodded, not because he agreed, but because he knew it was the only safe response. The meeting ended with a polite smile and an unspoken warning. He walked out of the office numb, carrying a silence that felt heavier than anything he'd lifted all day. Back in the janitor's closet, he sat on a small stool and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The words replayed in his head like a broken record. Know your place. He thought of his son, of every night he worked late so he could buy him books in Japanese and pizza on Fridays. He thought of Miyuki's laugh and how, for a moment, he didn't feel small around her. He felt seen. The next day, he avoided the balcony. He stuck to the lower floors, kept his head down, moved through the shadows like he used to. Miyuki passed him in the hallway once, and their eyes met briefly. Her smile faltered when she noticed something had changed in him. She opened her mouth to speak, but he looked away and kept walking. It wasn't coldness. It was fear. He couldn't afford to lose this job, not for a feeling he wasn't even sure he was allowed to have. And yet, something in him felt broken. In a building full of windows, Jake felt trapped. He didn't blame Miyuki. In fact, he tried not to think about her at all. But he missed the sound of her voice, the way she tilted her head when something surprised her. He missed being more than just the man who mopped the floors. That tiny sliver of connection they had built was now buried under rumors and rank. And yet, he wondered, was she thinking about him too? Did she feel the weight of what they were both being told to forget? One evening, as he was finishing up near the conference rooms, he heard a familiar voice behind him. Soft, uncertain. Jake. He turned, heart jumping into his throat. Miyuki stood there, alone, holding a small envelope in her hand. For a moment, neither of them moved. The building around them was quiet, but the air between them crackled with all the words they hadn't said. She took a step closer. Can we talk? Her voice wasn't cold. It wasn't distant. It was real. And Jake wasn't sure if he could answer. Miyuki sat at the long boardroom table, surrounded by suits, their voices sharp and eyes colder than the polished glass windows behind them. They weren't shouting, but every word landed like a blow. You're compromising the company's image, one said. This behavior is beneath your position, another added. She stayed quiet, listening, knowing there was no space here for feelings, only control. The accusation was clear. Involvement with a janitor? Unacceptable. The air felt thin. She straightened her back, but inside, something was cracking. She was being asked to choose. The meeting ended with a veiled ultimatum. Either she ended whatever that was or she'd face consequences. Loss of trust, leadership scrutiny, even possible removal. She nodded once, collected her papers, and walked out, not saying a word. Her steps echoed through the hallway as she returned to her office, the weight of silence heavier than anything. Behind closed doors, she looked out at the city and thought of Jake. Thought of his eyes when he listened, really listened. Thought of the way he spoke Japanese like it still meant something. Then she vanished. The next morning, Jake arrived early, like always. He checked his schedule, filled the mop bucket, and got to work. But something was different. Her office was dark. The usual morning guard detail wasn't there. The glass doors stood closed with the lights off inside. He asked around gently, but no one had answers, only shrugs and more whispers. One admin mentioned something about an emergency meeting, but even she didn't know where Miyuki had gone. Jake's chest tightened. Something was wrong. And this time, he had no idea how to fix it. Days passed. No sign of her. Jake tried to brush it off, told himself she was busy, traveling maybe. But the more time went by, the more the silence pressed on him. Every hallway felt colder without her presence. He caught himself looking at the elevator every time the doors opened, hoping she'd step out. She never did. He even tried calling her extension, no answer. Finally, desperate, he slipped a note under her office door. Just a simple question, "Are you okay?" But there was no reply. Not that day. Not the next. Jake started sleeping less. Nights stretched longer. He'd stare at the ceiling, remembering the way she smiled that night on the balcony. How her voice trembled when she admitted how lonely she felt. He wondered if she had anyone else to talk to. Anyone who saw her as more than her title. More than her silence. Maybe he had crossed a line. Maybe getting close to someone like her had always been a mistake. He'd told himself he didn't expect anything, But now that she was gone, it felt like something had been ripped away. He tried to pour himself into work. Cleaned faster. Moved quieter. Avoided eye contact. People still looked at him like he didn't belong. And now, without her quiet kindness showing otherwise, he felt the truth of it again. Invisible. Replaceable. That tiny window of color that had opened in his grayscale life was shut now. But the worst part wasn't the loss of hope. It was the haunting thought that maybe she had left, because of him. And he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd ruined something rare. One afternoon, as he wiped down the lobby windows, he heard someone ask a question near the front desk. The voice was soft, careful. It wasn't her, but it made him turn anyway. A man in a suit looked his way, holding an envelope. "Are you Jake?" he asked. Jake nodded slowly, confused. The man handed him the envelope, then left without another word. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a single line, handwritten in Japanese. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. No name. No return address. Just that. He read the line over and over, unsure what it meant. A goodbye? A warning? A promise? His chest ached with questions he couldn't answer. He tucked the note into his pocket and walked back to the janitor's room in silence. That night, as he lay beside his sleeping son, he held the note under the light. Her handwriting, he was sure of it. But she hadn't signed it. Hadn't explained anything. He felt like he was back at the beginning again, with more questions than he'd ever had before. Jake looked out the window, the city lights blinking like tiny beacons in the dark. He wondered where she was. If she missed him. If she regretted opening that door between them. Deep down, he feared the truth, that sometimes love isn't enough to fight the world around it. And maybe, for people like them, connections like that were never meant to last. He closed his eyes, still holding the note, as the silence wrapped itself around him once more. The hallway was quiet, just the soft hum of lights and the distant clatter of someone typing late on the upper floor. Jake moved slowly, mop in hand, finishing up his usual rounds. It was the end of the day, and the building had mostly emptied out. He preferred this time. Fewer people, less noise, more space to think. The elevator dinged behind him, but he didn't turn right away. Elevators opened and closed all the time. He kept working, wiping the last smudge off the marble floor near the lobby. Then he heard a sound he hadn't heard in days, the soft click of boots, familiar but different. He looked over his shoulder, and there she was, Miyuki, standing alone, framed by the elevator doors, dressed not in her usual blazer and heels but jeans and a light jacket. She had no badge, no assistant, no papers. Just a small suitcase by her side and something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Vulnerability. Her hair was tied back loosely, and for the first time, she looked more like a person than a boss. The moment stretched between them, neither of them speaking, the silence louder than ever. Jake froze, gripping the mop like a lifeline. She stepped out of the elevator slowly, her eyes never leaving his. He didn't move. His heart was pounding, unsure if he was dreaming or if this was real. There was no one else in the hallway. Just them. Just this. Then, softly, almost like a whisper meant only for him, she spoke in Japanese. Her voice was calm, steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "Naso. If you still want it, the next chapter is ours." Jake didn't answer at first. His mind tried to make sense of the moment, but his heart already knew the answer. He dropped the mop gently to the side, walking toward her with measured steps. "You came back," he said, not fully believing it yet. She nodded once, and he could see her eyes glisten. "I couldn't stay gone," she replied softly, this time in English. "I tried, but something kept pulling me back." He didn't ask why she left. He didn't need to. The weight of everything they'd faced hung in the air, but it no longer felt unbearable. It just felt real. He stopped just a few feet from her, close enough to see the small crack in her voice. Miyuki reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small keychain. It was shaped like a paper crane. She held it up and smiled, a little embarrassed. "This was my son's," she said. "I kept it all these years. I thought maybe your son would like it." Jake didn't speak. He took the crane from her hand, cradling it gently, and nodded. It wasn't about the object, it was what it meant. She hadn't just thought about him. She had thought about both of them. And that meant everything. The hallway lights flickered slightly, and the elevator doors began to close behind her. She turned, reached back, and held the door open with her hand. "I don't know where I'm going," she said, "but I know I don't want to go alone." Jake took one last look down the hall, the way he always did before finishing his shift. Tonight, though, he didn't care about unfinished floors or dirty glass. He looked back at her, then stepped into the elevator. The doors slid shut behind them with a quiet final click. Inside the elevator, the silence returned, but this time it felt different. It wasn't heavy, it was full. Full of possibility. She glanced at him, half smiling, and he smiled back, shy but sure. "So," he said softly, "where's this next chapter starting?" She laughed, not loudly, but it echoed in the small space like music. "Anywhere but here," she replied, her voice full of something new. The elevator kept moving, floor by floor, like time itself was giving them one last chance. When the doors opened again, it wasn't to a fancy office or a crowded hallway. It was just the parking garage. Still, it felt like the beginning of something. Jake followed her out, carrying nothing but his coat and that small crane in his pocket. She looked back once, and he knew, whatever came next, it wouldn't be perfect. But it would be real. And this time, they wouldn't be facing it alone. Together, they walked toward the exit, toward something undefined. Not a fairy tale. Not a rescue. Just two people choosing each other, again. And as they stepped into the warm night air, headlights flashing past, and the sound of the city buzzing in the distance, neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. Some stories don't end with fireworks or tears. Some just shift quietly with a single step forward. And maybe that's how you know it's real, when the most unexpected ending feels just right. In the end, this isn't just Jake and Miyuki's story. It's about how love can grow in the quietest corners of life. About seeing someone through pain and choosing to try again. Because sometimes, the deepest connections come from the most unexpected places and last forever. If this story touched your heart, write in the comments, "Love doesn't need translation." And if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this one, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. There's so much more ahead for us to experience together.